Hello everybody and welcome back to Law and Court Cases. In today's video we're going to be covering 10 serial killers who have never been caught. Kind of got a little bit of inspiration from Call Me Chris for this because she's recently done a video on some unsolved cases and it kind of inspired me to go down that rabbit hole a little bit, so I'm hoping you guys enjoy this change, and if you didn't, just leave a comment down below to let me know. Anyway, today I'm going to be covering 10 cases of serial killers who have never been caught. And some of these cases may be closer to being solved than we think. So, without further ado, let's get into the video. The first case we're going to be talking about is the babysitter killer, also known as the Oakland County child killer. This person is an unidentified serial killer who murdered at least 4 children in Oakland County, Michigan between 1976 and 1977. The killer's macabre alias comes from the fact that he bathed each child before committing the crimes, which led FBI profilers to posit that the killer may have some form of twisted parental instinct. The killer's choice to target children gripped parents through Michigan and spawned dozens of neighborhood watch initiatives. Despite a few promising leads, including the discovery of a vehicle that they suspected belonged to the killer, the case remains open and unsolved. The most recent development was in 2012, when investigators managed to create a DNA profile of the killer. Unfortunately, it didn't match anyone arrested in conjunction with the case, or anyone in the police system for that matter. All 4 children were held from anywhere between 4 to 19 days before being bathed and killed. Moving on to the next case, which is the Highway Tears killer or killers. Canada has its fair share of heinous murderers, including more than a few remaining unsolved. Perhaps the most infamous are the Highway of Tears murders in British Columbia. The highway is a 450-mile or 724-kilometre stretch of Highway 16 between Prince George and Prince Rupert, and has the unfortunate destination of being the site of at least 18 and possibly as many as 40 murders, as well as disappearances between 1969 and 2011. Most of these victims are Indigenous women. Since the murders span 50 years, investigators believe that multiple killers were patrolling the highway. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police, the RCMP, found only enough evidence to prosecute one of the murders, leaving the other 17 cases unsolved. Unfortunately, investigators have concluded the perpetrator's whereabouts over the decades in question mean he could only be responsible for 2 of the other killings at most. So it's likely that the other killer or killers still remain at large to this day. Moving on to Bible John. Spurring Scotland's most extensive manhunt, the answer to who exactly is Bible John has shifted over the years. The serial killer's identity has remained a mystery for 50-something years, since the murders of Patricia Docker in 1968 and Jemima MacDonald and Helen Pudlock in 1969. All victims were in their late 20s or early 30s. The victims were beaten and sexually assaulted before their murders, after meeting the killer at the same popular Glasgow nightclub, the Barrowland Ballroom. The few details known about the case came from Helen Pudlock's sister, Jean, who shared a taxi with her sister and the supposed killer on the night of Helen's murder. Jean's information helped investigators form a psychological profile of the killer, who supposedly made frequent references to the Bible, hence his nickname of Bible John. Unfortunately, Jean died in 2010, and as she was the only witness associated with the case, the chances of finding the true identity of Bible John are next to nothing. Moving on to the Alphabet Killer. The Alphabet murders occurred in the early 1970s in Rochester, New York. The killer's alias comes from his choice of victims. He only chose victims, all of whom were young girls, with first and last names beginning with the same letter. The Alphabet Killer's 3 victims were sexually assaulted and strangled, while there were several witnesses, including several motorists who saw 10-year-old Carmen Colon half naked on the side of the road attempting to escape from the killer. Police have never managed to close the case. Despite having several persons of interest in the case, one of whom was connected as recently as 2011. However, none of the 4 men considered by authorities could be linked to the crimes. Though one was later sentenced to death for the murders of sex workers in Nevada, interestingly, all of his victims also had alliterative names. Moving on to the West Mesa Bone Collector. With a nickname that seems as much made for a movie poster as a police investigation, the so-called West Mesa Bone Collector may be currently active in the town of Albuquerque, New Mexico, or anywhere else for that matter. The mysterious killer hit the spotlight in 2009 when police found 11 bodies buried in an area of Albuquerque called West Mesa. Following a tip that a woman had noticed a human femur bone partially uncovered in a former construction site, police excavated the area and discovered the bodies of women who'd been reported missing in 2003 and 2005. There are still at least 13 other missing women who may have also been victims of the West Mesa Bone Collective, reported missing as recently as 2006. Police considered several suspects, but lacked enough evidence to make a strong case against anyone. Recent theories have suggested that the West Mesa Bone Collector may actually be multiple people running a sex trafficking ring, possibly because many of the victims were involved in sex work. As recently as 2021, police confirmed that the case is still active, though despite police receiving roughly 20 to 30 tips per year, no new evidence has moved the case along. The reward for useful information on the case is currently $100,000. The Servant Girl Annihilator. One of America's first known serial killers, the Servant Girl Annihilator, as he was called in the parlance of the time, killed 7 women and 1 man in Austin, Texas between December of 1884 and December of 1885. All the victims were domestic staff, either killed while sleeping or dragged out of their beds and killed outside their home. In just one night of December 24th, 1885, the killer murdered 3 victims with an axe, a signature that earned him the more politically correct nickname, the Austin Axe Murderer. Because this case is nearly 125 years old, police records are spotty, though a New York Times article from December 26th of 1885 wrote that more than 400 people were arrested in conjunction with the case. Modern researchers have suggested that the Austin Axe Murderer may be none other than Jack the Ripper himself, who sent Londoners into a panic just 3 years later in 1888. Realistically, the true Servant Girl Annihilator was likely local Nathan Elgin, who only had 4 toes on 1 foot, matching footprints found at most of the murder scenes. Elgin was killed by police officer John Bracken in 1886. Bracken shot him after responding to help a girl who'd been dragged from a saloon by a drunk man and he was beating her. The Long Island Killer. This is one of the cases that could very well be close to being solved. The aptly named Long Island Killer is an unknown murderer who's been killing in New York from 1996 to possibly the present day, making this case as old as I am. Somewhere between 10 and 17 murders have been attributed to the Long Island Killer, and since he may or may not still be in operation, he's one of the most recent serial killers in American history to remain at large. Authorities knew very little about the suspect, speculating that he's likely a white male in his mid-20s to 40s, with extensive knowledge of law enforcement operations and techniques, which would explain how he successfully avoided capture. Though the Long Island Killer has killed at least a dozen people, police were unaware that so many of the prior disappearances and murders were linked until the 2010 disappearance of Shanann Gilbert. While searching in the area where she likely disappeared, police came across not just her body, but also the bodies of 10 more victims, buried underneath the sand of the Long Island Gilgo Beach. A suspect was charged in 2023, a man named Rex Herman, who was arrested for 3 of the murders associated with the Long Island Killer case. In January of 2024, he received a 4th charge, and in June 2024, 2 more charges were added. He has pled not guilty, and at this time, he has not been convicted of these crimes. Now moving on to the Black Doodler, yet another case that could very well be close to being solved. The Doodler could perhaps have been given a more flattering nickname, like the artist or the sketcher, had he been kinder to the male models who posed for him. But instead, he sexually assaulted and stabbed them, ultimately killing somewhere between 6 to 14 victims in San Francisco. From January of 1974 to September of 1975, several men disappeared from the city's gay community, and several more were injured or the victims of attempted murder. Though San Francisco has always been quite liberal, members of the LGBTQ community were generally not accepted into San Francisco's mainstream community in the 1970s, leading many of the killer's surviving victims to decline to cooperate with police for fear of being outed. As a result, there was very little information for authorities to go on, and the case remains open and unsolved. However, as I mentioned before, police may be close to solving this decades-old mystery. More of the victims have now been willing to come forward in the last few years, and thanks to DNA and fingerprint evidence, authorities have said they've narrowed down to one person of interest who still resides in San Francisco today. There is currently a $200,000 reward for anyone that helps them find the final pieces of evidence to prosecute this case. Now moving on to the Zodiac Killer. The Zodiac Killer is perhaps the most infamous unsolved serial killer case in the United States. Much like Jack the Ripper did in London nearly a century prior, the Zodiac taunted police by sending investigators and the San Francisco Bay Press cryptic messages and clues over a one-year period in the late 1960s. In a true game of cat and mouse, the killer made himself known to city residents by leaving clues at the murder scenes. He threatened to shoot school buses full of children and mail pieces of victims' clothing to the San Francisco Chronicle newspaper, and threatened the public if newspapers didn't publish the cryptic letters that became his hallmark. As of 2022, only 2 of the killer's 4 ciphers, which he demanded be published in the paper lest he claim more victims, have been definitively solved. Police first opened the case in 1969, after the double murder of 2 high schoolers parked on a lover's lane. 5 murders have been definitively linked to the case through the Zodiac, who gave himself that nickname, although he claims to have killed 37 people in total. There have been numerous suspects over the years, but this case is still very much open and unsolved. Moving on to our final killer, probably one of the most infamous in the world, and definitely the most infamous in London, Jack the Ripper. It's hard to say why London's Jack the Ripper is arguably the most famous serial killer in the world. It could be because he committed his crimes so long ago, in 1888, and therefore it's so far removed from the current times that there is no one to connect to the case, but yet people are still keeping it alive. It could also be because of the brutality of his killings that earned him the hair-raising nickname, or just simply because he was never caught, despite operating in a society that prided itself on law and social order. Jack the Ripper is often credited for jump-starting the modern-day serial killer fixation. He murdered at least 5 women in London's East End. The murders kept London on edge, especially as the police questioned men in professions ranging from butchers to surgeons to barbers, but failed to produce a credible suspect. During Jack the Ripper's time frame, police and authorities received hundreds of letters signed by Jack the Ripper. While most were frauds, at least 4 letters likely were from the Ripper himself, including the infamous From Hell letter that inspired fictions ranging from comic books all the way to Hollywood movies. Given that most of the police records on the case were destroyed in World War II bombings, it's likely that the case will never be solved. But this does not stop amateur sleuths from pointing the fingers in all directions, ranging from author Lewis Carroll, the author of the Alice in Wonderland books, to none other than 2 men linked to Queen Victoria herself, her surgeon John Williams, and her grandson and presumptive to the throne, Prince Albert Victor. Despite having a pretty long list of suspected killers, the Jack the Ripper case will remain unsolved. If any of these cases kind of jumped out at you and you want me to do a deep dive into them, then please let me know in the comments down below and I'd be happy to do so. I really do hope that the Long Island Killer case and the San Francisco Black Doodler case will be solved soon. I really hope so, because I feel like these victims deserve justice and I believe their families deserve peace, knowing that it's going to be resolved in their lifetime. So fingers crossed new leads are made and they're able to link these cases permanently. Anyway, I hope you liked this video. If you did, please leave a like and a comment down below. And if you're not already subscribed, please subscribe to the channel. We'd love to have you here. But anyway, that'll be it from me for today. I hope you have a wonderful day and I will see you next time. Bye for now.